Record. Hey guys, it's Miss Johnson. I just wanted to take some time to go over your vocabulary with you today and give you some tips and just some things to think about and refer to as we're going through the vocab. I was trying to share my screen here. Oh, there it goes. Trying to share my screen here for you to see, and hopefully this will help you a little bit. All right, so your vocabulary. Gosh, I felt like this was bigger earlier, and now it feels very small. It's hard to see. So let me see if I can. Oh, there we go. There, it's wider. Lighten that up a little bit for you. All right. So going over our vocabulary here, some specific words, starting with the word allele. And so allele is one of those first words that you're working on today. An allele is basically a representation of it, or basically the gene for each trait. For every trait, you're going to have two alleles. Remember that as diploid, we get one copy of our DNA from mom and one copy from dad. So it's that combination of both of them together that makes you who you are. And so for every trait, you're going to have two alleles. And we're going to continue and talk about that term allele as we work through the rest of these terms as well. The next term, genotype, and it's got the word geno in it, which kind of sounds like gene. And so a genotype is the gene combination. So remember, for your genotype, your genes, like I just said, you get one set of each of your genes from your mom and from your dad. So for your genotype, you're going to have two alleles for each gene, one from mom, one from dad. And so oftentimes we're going to use, at least for our simple stuff as we start here, we're going to use letters. We're going to use combinations of letters to represent genotypes. So you might have a big T, or big T, or little t, and we'll talk about what those letters mean. But we're always going to represent genotypes with letters. Okay, and so again, remember being diploid, we get one copy of our genes from mom and one copy of our genes from dad. So each of these represents what mom gave us and what dad gave us. Each of these letters often or also represents an allele. So for each trait, you have two alleles, one from mom, one from dad. Those genotypes determine the phenotype. So geno sounds like gene, but pheno starts with a P, and so think about physical. So phenotype is the physical expression of a gene.
Shouldn't that be 10?
I can't spell EXPR. Okay, so a genotype is a physical expression of a gene. So for each genotype, it's going to determine what you look like or how a cell functions. And so just for simple explanation right now, our T's might represent whether a plant is tall or whether it's short. So those are both physical expressions of a genotype. And so for every phenotype, you have two alleles that determine what trait you're going to express. What determines how you're going to express those traits is whether the traits are dominant or recessive. And we're going to make this simple for now, and then we'll add some more. There's more complex genetics that we'll talk about later. But for right now, we're just going to talk about simple, what we call Mendelian genetics. So traits can either be dominant, and we use a capital letter to indicate that allele, or recessive, and we use a lowercase letter to represent that allele. So dominant traits tend to mask recessive traits. So if a dominant trait is present, if you have a capital letter, it's going to mask or cover up the recessive trait or the lowercase letter. And again, this is just the simple version of genetics for now. We'll learn this, and then we'll do some more complex genetics later, because not everything is this simple. So going back to the beginning again, so you have two alleles for each trait. One came from mom, one came from dad. The two of those together make your genotype. Okay, so again, we've got two letters to represent what came from mom and what came from your dad. The expression of those two together make your phenotype. Your phenotype determined by the genotype and whether the trait was dominant and tends to mask one of the recessive trait, or whether it's recessive and it gets covered up easily. because you get two alleles for each trait, we look at whether the alleles are the same or different. And so these word parts here, homo and hetero. Homo means the same. And so if a trait is homozygous, then you have two of the same letters. So you could have two capital letters and we would say homozygous dominant, or you could have two lowercase letters, put that there, two lowercase letters, and we would say that the trait is homozygous recessive. So if the letters are the same, either both capital or both lowercase, we say that it's homozygous. And then hetero means different. And so heterozygous is when two letters are different. You have one dominant and one recessive. So if the alleles, so we got two alleles, if they're the same, then we say it's homozygous. If the alleles are different, we say it's heterozygous. Now, oftentimes we refer to homozygous as purebred. So if you see the word purebred, that's telling you that it's homozygous, and it could be homozygous dominant or it could be homozygous recessive. But if you see the word purebred, it's telling you that it's homozygous. And then oftentimes we use the word hybrid. Oops, I can't spell. I don't know why I'm adding extra letters. There's no E on the word end of hybrid. It's just a fancy D, I guess. Hybrid. So if it's heterozygous, then it's got two different alleles. We say it's a hybrid. It's a mix of the two. All right. So if we know an organism's genotype, we can figure out often the phenotype. So if we know the gene combination, we can figure out the physical expression of that, the phenotype. We can also use that to figure out if you have two parents with a particular trait, what their offsprings could end up looking like. And so we do that with a Punnett Square. And a Punnett Square is going to help us to figure out probabilities. And we'll talk about both of these terms together. Now, you may remember doing Punnett Squares from middle school. You might have either loved them or hated them. But once you learn, they're not too difficult. And we'll do some simple Punnett Squares as we start here, but then as we get some more complex genetic stuff, we'll add a little bit more complexity to it. So in a Punnett Square, we're going to put the parents on the side and the top, so on the outside, and then what we put on the inside is the offspring. So what's on the outside represents the parent. And what we have on the inside here represents the offspring. Okay, so if we have two parents, so this parent is homozygous dominant, and this parent is heterozygous, we can figure out what are the possibilities of their offspring and the probability of how that would happen in any population. So the way we fill in a Punnett Square, we're going to take the letter from the side with the letter in the column. So here we've got big T and we've got big T. So here we'd have big T, big T. On this next box, we're going to take the letter here and the letter here. We're always, if there's a capital letter, we're always going to put that one first. So we'd have big T, little t. And then here we're going to have big T again. Self-affirm. And then over here, we would have big T, little t. So inside of the box represents the possible offspring with these two parents if we were to cross them, if they were to produce offspring. So here we'd have a 50% chance. So 2 out of 4, we would have homozygous dominant. And then 2 out of 4, we would produce, or they would produce heterozygous. So there's a 50-50 chance of producing homozygous dominant versus heterozygous offspring. And so that's essentially, the Punnett Square helps us to figure out the probability of what would be produced in that cross. And so thinking about probability, if you have a coin, it's 2 sides, heads and tails. So if you flip it, the probability of flipping a head is 50%. The probability of flipping a tail is 50%. But if you were to flip that coin 10 times, you wouldn't necessarily get 5 heads and 5 tails. You're going to get a variation on that. But over a large number of times of doing it, you would get closer to that 50% mark. And so we'll talk more about probability, but probability is basically what are the chances? And so there's a 50-50 chance of producing either one of these type of offspring, but it's not guaranteed that they're going to produce 50% of these and 50% of these. Now, these offspring all would have the same phenotype, even though they all have different genotypes. And so that's what we're going to move on to as we work here over the next week. So that's a quick review of all your vocabulary. Hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to email me with any questions, and I'll be happy to get to those as quickly as I can. All right. Talk to you guys later.